Um, I'm going to probably stand and talk loudly, but if you can't hear me, just say, and I will talk even louder. But I don't know if some of you know me, but my name is Kristen Hopper. I am an archaeologist. I work at Durham University in the UK. And this session is just going to be a bit about publications, specifically sort of the process of preparing and submitting a publication to like a peer-reviewed journal. So I know everybody here is at different stages, but how many people here have submitted to a journal already? Anybody? A few? How many people feel a bit overwhelmed by the whole process? Anybody who's like, anyone who's tried it, right?
I haven't tried it yet.
Yeah, okay, still overwhelmed,
Yeah.
right? So I just wanted to sort of give a brief introduction to this, and then take any sort of questions that you might have that you've been thinking about in terms of your own kind of careers or what you're thinking of publishing, and then we can all kind of help and try and answer those questions. And as part of that, basically what I'm going to talk about today actually, just a moment, it is not advancing. Aha, there we go. So what I'm going to talk about today, actually, a lot of this material stemmed out of a project that we did at Durham University, which was called Rewriting World Archaeology. And so it was Durham University in conjunction with the journal Antiquity. And the idea was that we kind of came together to think about how can we, rewrite world archaeology, because at the moment, who publishes and whose voice is heard by everyone, it's a really biased thing, isn't it? So this graphic we produced for the project shows you inequalities in publishing. So the country size is proportional to the amount of journal articles, scientific journal articles that are published. And as you can see, places like America and Western Europe dominate that, right? And so they're the ones who are creating a lot of the narratives. But really, what we need is we need more voices internationally to be able to publish their work and get it out there and be part of those dialogues and conversations. And obviously I come from archaeology, so this is really from an archaeology context. But a lot of what I'm going to say is very, very relevant to anyone sort of publishing in humanities and social sciences. So briefly, the project that I was part of said, yes, absolutely, take the material, share it with everybody, because I think it's really good to sort of pass this on. So when we're talking about sort of the journal article journey, I kind of want to talk about a few steps. First, thinking about sort of planning and preparing publications, the process of actually submitting article, the terrifying peer review process, or some people might find it a bit terrifying, and then kind of what happens towards the end of that whole sort of thing. See, this looks of people are like, we've been through this several times. So I think one of the key things to really think about, and I should say as we go, if you want to ask questions as I'm going, please ask questions as I go. I'd rather this be kind of a conversation than me just talking loudly at you and gesturing a lot. So I've provided you guys with a handy sort of like overview that kind of goes through a lot of these points that if you need more copies, we can print more. But really, when you're thinking about sort of planning and preparing a journal article, one of the key things you kind of want to think about is who are your audience? Who are the people that you are writing for? I think you can be at kind of different stages of your career. For instance, say you've just finished your PhD and you're like, okay, I need to publish a journal article now. But often it's difficult because you have this giant PhD and you want to share absolutely everything. But how do you then turn that into something that is targeted at the correct journal and the right audience, right? So you want to think about your paper being read by those in the wider discipline. So you want to write for the non-specialist, which is one of the advice I think that you were giving as well for the grant applications. You want to make sure that everybody understands what it is you're writing about. And think about who do you want to read your paper, because that will also help you think about which journal you want to target. Which journal do you want to try and apply to so that your paper is read by the right people for you. And that's going to differ, right, depending on, if you specialize in archaeobotany or you do GIS or you're a historian, that's going to change. And then again, like I said, which journal you're targeting. A really good thing to do at this stage is to speak to peers. I mean, we're creating a great network of peers here today. Speak to mentors. You know, I'm sure most of the people on Stepsisters would be more than happy to have a chat with people about journal choices. And choose the right journal for your subject matter. The other thing that I think that sometimes is easy to get lost in, especially if you're kind of embarking on sort of publishing your first, major article, is really thinking about what is the selling point of that article, right? Why should readers be interested in what you have to say? And so thinking about what is the significance of your research? What is original about your paper? Is it particularly exciting because it's a new data set? Is it touching on a particularly timely topic? So maybe right now we could be talking about gender or decolonization or climate change. A lot of these are hot topics, so maybe it ties into one of those things. Is it something that's relevant, not just to other people who do, 12th century coins in one place? Is there a wider theme in there that can then be applicable to people who do archaeology in Denmark? Do you know what I mean? You've got to kind of think about the applicability of that. And I think this is something when I was first starting off, this is something that I think I struggled with, is really finding it. What is your unique kind of selling point that you want to sort of put forward with your article? The other thing to think about is how to structure your paper. And this is where it's really important, I think, before you go about writing an article, is to know where it is that you want to submit that article. Because different journals have different formats. So you want to know whether or not you're targeting a journal that wants a 6,000 word article or a journal that allows for a much, much longer article with supplementary material. Keep it clear and simple, and think about using, sort of key sections like I've sort of outlined here, and a lot of this is in the handout so you can have a look. And another thing is when you're kind of at this stage where you're like, look, I've got this journal I want to submit to, I've got a sort of, draft of the article. If you have the opportunity, ask a peer, ask a mentor, a trusted academic in your field to read through your paper and consider it a sort of pre-peer review. I know that this can be quite daunting to, let your research go to somebody else for criticism, but again, I think this is why we're having this kind of conference. This is why we have Stepsisters, so you build that network of people that you might say, hey, would you read my article and give me a bit of feedback before I submit it? Sort of things to keep in mind for planning and preparing your article is think about the writing style. What kind of style of writing is appropriate for the journal that you're submitting to, appropriate for your discipline, right? Bibliographies. Make sure those bibliographies are consistent and formatted in the way that that journal wants them to be formatted, right? It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. Be aware of word limits. Some journals are very strict about their word limits. If they say they want 6,000 words and you have 6,250, they'll be like, no, too much. Others will be a bit more lenient. But you need to really think about that when you're writing. And the other thing is figures and tables. Is make them clear. Don't overcrowd tables and figures. Think about the resolution of images. I've reviewed many articles for journals that people submit pictures and images thinking, oh, that'll be fun. But as soon as it's blown up into anything, it's terrible, right? You need to have high resolution images. Get hold of those. And the one thing, and I'll touch on this when I do another session tomorrow about preparing maps and plans for publication, is you need to make sure that you have the copyright for reproducing any images if they're ones that are already been used or made by someone else. If you're creating them yourself, then obviously if you're using any bits of anything else, again, you need to make sure that it is open source or out of copyright and so on. So very, very key, because journals will definitely pick up on that. Right. So kind of moving to the next stage is thinking about submitting your article. Most journals these days have online submission platforms, which are generally okay, but can be a little bit cumbersome to use. But there's a few different ones that they tend to use, so make sure you kind of know which platform that the journal you're looking at is using. One of the key things that I would say is that almost every journal you submit to will ask you to suggest reviewers, right? Don't skip on doing this. You know, make sure that you suggest people who you think would be good to peer review your paper. Who are the scholars in your discipline whose opinions that you value, right? Who do you think that you would say, I'd like them to read this and I think that they would, you know, do a good job at reviewing this paper. So it's really important to think about people who, and also to think about people who you don't want to review your article if there's potentially a conflict of interest or something that you know is not going to be a fair review. Because what you want is a fair review, right? The peer review process. So I remember submitting one of my first articles with some co-authors and getting back the review. And the first time you get back a review and you see all these suggestions and you think, oh my gosh, how am I going to deal with this? And I guess the thing is to, if you've had a peer review and your paper is accepted, I would say almost every single time you will still have revisions, even if they said, yeah, we're going to publish this article, but you will have revisions. And the thing to keep in mind is just, you know, don't get upset about those criticisms. In general, your reviewers are there to give you another scholarly opinion on your work, and what they say often can help to make your work better, to make it stronger. However, you know, you have to respond to those criticisms systematically. So I'd say, you know, you go through, you respond to those criticisms, but, you know, also stick up for yourself if you do think that they may have misunderstood what it is that you meant to say, with a justification of your position. You don't have to agree with everything they say, but you have to justify why you don't agree with it, right? And then you can send those back. The editor will confirm that you've made the recommended changes, and then we'll usually provisionally accept your paper or return it for further edits. And I think this is the part that I think people who may be doing this the first time, it's quite daunting when you get back that first set of corrections. But obviously, you know, if you do, well, hey, I'm trying to make it be like, you did it. You know, if you do that, and it's then accepted, you will then have another round of editing and proofs where the journal will typeset your paper and send it back for you to check one last time, and you'll make it look like the format of the journal. And then, that's where the fireworks come in. You get published. Often you'll be published first online, later in print. And I don't want to go into too much detail because I want to have lots of time for questions. But there's also lots of options these days. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about open access and what's going on. And that can also be a bit of a minefield to deal with as well, because often journals charge high fees to make things open access, which is particularly unfair and I don't necessarily agree with, but hey. So again, it might be worthwhile looking to see if your individual institution has any agreements with particular publishers. Or I have noticed that there are some publishers now that are offering sort of open access grants to especially young scholars coming sort of from outside of Western Europe and America and stuff like that to actually publish open access. So it is always worth asking the questions or getting some advice from somebody else in the field to see if there's any options for you to make your work more accessible, right? So I'm going to stop there and just say, I know that was like a hectic journey through the journal publication process. If anybody has any questions, or do you want to talk about any of your own experiences, or anything like that, then let me know, please.
I have a comment for finding reviewers. like suggesting reviewers, that was always the hardest thing for me. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. And there are two things. One is that there is this online Google Doc, honestly, is what it is, a Google Sheet, where early career researchers have put their names that say they're willing to review manuscripts, because often what happens is you'll suggest a big name in your field and they just won't do it because they don't have time to do it. So like that's why it takes so long for your paper to go into review. So that's a good resource. And then if you're publishing with co-authors, you also need to check with them about people to and not to suggest. And like that's a step that sometimes gets lost, but is very important.
Absolutely.
What's the name of that?
I'll find it.
Yeah, if you have it, share it with everyone. Yeah. I mean, it's always better to suggest more reviewers. You know, don't just suggest one. Suggest more if you can. Do you know what I mean? Because then there's more likely to get different people. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in with any thoughts.
Do you have any, like, turning analyses into publication?
I mean, I think it's just like a smaller version of the PhD. It's about identifying kind of like a key theme, right? Because an entire master's thesis or an entire PhD is too much for an article, right?
Yeah.
And it depends on your field, because some fields, books are much more put an entire thesis into one journal article. It's just too much. You know, so maybe it's sort of thinking about how you're going to divide 2 or 3 different articles out of a much larger piece of work.